Hi guys, it's Frank here again, and today I'd like to share a message which is taken out of the devotional that I've been reading for the past few days, and it's entitled "How to Love People You Disagree With." And even though I've been reading it for the past few days, I haven't started recording anything until recently. It's because I wanted to get to a point of being able to absorb everything first before I say anything or something about it. And I've been thinking about this lately, and I just want to read this first. Like, when you decide to live a life that pleases God, you can never be exempted from the fact that you have to learn how to deal with pain. Why? Because at some point in your life, you will be offended and you will get hurt. Despite of your good intentions, there will always be things that won't go your way. You know how funny it is sometimes, like you do a lot of things with good intentions, but some people will always take it in the wrong way. And can't help but to feel bad about it. And that's when recently I've decided to start a devotional that basically would help me to deal with this kind of situation. And hence, that's why how to love people you disagree with. And I'd like to start by reading something off of this devotional. It says in here, love considers others first. Love looks for the best. Love shows respect. Love seeks unity. Love isn't selfish. Love offers the best. And love displays patience. And as I'm reading through this, I'm reminded of the scripture that's written in Galatians that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, gentleness, and self control. And when you think about all those things, you can only do good unto others if your mind is set on the things of God. But it's a totally different thing when you're just reading it in the Bible and you're not bothered by anything, and you're confined in your own space. You have your own time. Nothing is bothering you. Or you're not worried about work, or you're not. In my case, you're not being called by your kids, or my attention is not being called by my wife to help her with some chores. And those are the times when I'm actually recording this because there's a time when I feel like there's a good message that I need to put out there for people to be inspired and encouraged. But it's totally different thing when you're out of the laboratory or the classroom and you have to apply what you just learned. And that's the difficult part because sometimes, as much as you would want to do good, sometimes your patience is just tested. And just like in a classroom setting, you know how sometimes a teacher would come in and they would just give out a pop-up quiz and say, hey, you have a quiz today. And there are things in life that just happens when you'd be totally caught off guard, and that's when your patience and your faith and your love for God will be tested. And how can we deal with that? For a lot of times, and I think that's not just me, that's all of us. We want to avoid pain. I mean, after all, who wants to get hurt, right? I don't know about you, but I don't like that feeling, especially when fact of the matter is loving others involves pain. And yeah, as frustrating as it sounds, it is what it is. Love means giving of yourself. Love means putting your heart out for someone to potentially wound. And so, for the young people out there, if you think like love is just all about this butterfly feelings and being swept off your feet, just like how you see things in the movies, I'm sorry to rain in your parade, but that's not love. That's just an ideal picture of what Hollywood movies and Disney movies and cartoons would want to show. But real love, as a matter of fact, because I really want to keep this video short, I don't want to keep rambling. Cut the long story short, you look at Jesus Christ's sacrifice on the cross, and that's what love is. Recently I've watched a video, a movie with my kids, Superman Red Sun. And thanks to David Chan, my friend, who posted that in one of his mini blogs on Facebook. And when I read it, and for me, I took that as a good recommendation, and I haven't had a chance until recently when I watched it. And it's amazing how uh, Superman, for all of you who doesn't know this or unaware, Superman is actually the embodiment of hope in the DC universe. And when Superman was actually uh, conceptualized, his character is likened to Jesus Christ. And uh, the highlight of that animated movie for me was the fact that in the end he sacrificed himself to save humanity. But it's not that simple idea that Superman dying for humanity that likens him to Jesus Christ. It should be noted that the title is Red Son. It's because he grew up in Russia, and as you might have already known, in Russia, their government is uh, taken from Karl Marx ideology, and that's communism. And pretty much just like what China is as a country, everything is controlled. Nobody has the right to speak against a government. Everything is suppressed. No freedom of speech. While the United States, on the other hand, is upholding democracy, where they're becoming like the model for the rest of the world to follow because of justice and liberty and freedom of speech. And yeah, that's what democracy is all about. And it should be noted that while these two contrasting ideas is, even up to this point, a hot topic around the world, I haven't been able to wrap my hand around it until recently. And yeah, it's so funny that watching that animated film somehow gave me a better grasp at it. Because in communism, while everything is like a utopian idea where everything is equal and everything is good, there's not much of a gap between the rich and the poor. Problem is, it has its dark side. Not everybody would want to live in a controlled environment. While democracy on the other side is headed by the capitalists. And in the world of capitalism, success will always be at the cost of somebody else suffering at the bottom. And so these two conflicting ideas causes this war between these countries. Now, you might be thinking, well, I started talking about love, and why is it that I started to talk about Superman, and where is all these things leading into? I'm going to get there. So, um, the point here is these two conflicting ideas, for me, and this is my reflection, is like both of them want to achieve something good, but the means by how it is achieved is totally different. Uh, and someone always has to suffer. Something has to give in. And as much as we want to get the best of both worlds, unfortunately, it's just this is something that's really so hard for I think for everyone to wrap their head around. And I think it's just fair for us to think like, so how and the best question to ask is, how do we get around this? How do we fix this? And this is where the gospel kicks in. This is where Jesus Christ and his sacrifice on the cross and his message to us is so important because love is what will fix everything. Cheesy as it sounds, again. And yeah, it's just fair for you to ask, like, how could love be the answer to all of these conflict? Well, if you're going to tread with me in your thought for a while, if you're really going to think about it, communism is a good ideology for equality, peace, prosperity, where there's no jealousy because whatever another person has, everybody has it. And so there's no supposedly room for to feel like jealousy or anything that goes along those lines. But then again, there is a sacrifice, and it's a sad thing when everything is controlled. You don't have the freedom to think for your own, and you just basically have to take whatever the government has to say, and that's a hard thing. On the other side of democracy, everybody has the right to speak their own mind, freedom of speech, do everything what they like, but then it has a crazy side to it. And when things are out of control, you know how people can be so privileged, like they are so entitled that they don't have a sense of what's right and what's wrong anymore. And how do you strike a balance between the two? And for me, this is where the message of love and Christ's sacrifice on the cross would bridge that divide. Why? Because if you're going to think about it, if people will just have a sense of responsibility and love, just like Jesus Christ did, it will basically fix everything and bridge the gap between the cracks of this broken world, which we are all hoping to see become better one day. And unfortunately, when it comes to love, that's the challenge. It's sacrificial love. You can't avoid not getting hurt. And sometimes in order for one person to get that message across, in the case of Jesus, he had to die. I don't think there's anyone else in the world who did something so great with such a great impact that even up to this point in our lives, it is so relevant. The message of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice on the cross, which is an expression of God's love, would basically uh, overtake any other analogy, story, or movie in Hollywood about love that is available out there. And just to cap things, just to place this rambling into a close, to conclude why love is the greatest thing that would fix the brokenness of this world that we're in. It's because if you're going to think about it, love is not selfish, it's not self-seeking. And yes, you could check as a reference in First Corinthians chapter 13, which is often quoted in wedding ceremonies. And I would encourage you to read more of that. But just to bring this short message of encouragement, if you're really going to think about love, love is an action. It's not just in speech, and it's not supposed to be driven because we want to get something in return. Love is living out a life as an example for others to see, in hope that they might be able to see it also in the same light, and being convinced, fully convinced, that love is the greatest thing that we can show for others to follow, in addition to something that's motivational, encouraging, and inspiring. Think about the domino effect that it will do. It will basically bridge the gap of misunderstanding, which is part of the reason why people are in conflict. It is the catalyst for change that will cause people to think of their motives and not be selfish. It is love which will drive people to change for the better, because you would want to contribute something that's going to make this world a better place. And in my case, love is what motivates me to do the things that I do, because I was able to receive it in the first place when I was first invited by a stranger to attend a church service. And I remember that time back in 2001, um, Victory Christian Fellowship, Alabang. The youth service back then was called Youth on Fire. And I won't forget this guy, Krish Pincaro, who invited me to attend the service, and everything else was history from that point. But of course, it wasn't. Just like every other story, it has its ups and downs. It wasn't my walk with Christ, it wasn't always perfect. But that's another message. Because of the grace of God, just like what I've shared in the last video, I am what I am. And I am still indebted to the people who showed kindness, who spoke words of wisdom, who went out of their way to reach out and took the time to share the gospel and give me a good example of how it is to live a life that is worthy of our calling and election, because of the love that we have received from Jesus Christ and his realizing his sacrifice on the cross. So before I add more to these ramblings, I want to consciously stop myself right now. And if there's anything that I would hope that you would be able to take away from this, it is the fact that love involves pain. It is and while I understand the propensity to just move away from it and forget about it and just be self-centered and look at ourselves, which is the exact opposite of what love is trying to accomplish. And by the way, that is what the devil, your enemy, wants for you to do, to just be self-centered, look at yourself, save yourself, forget about the rest. It's a dog eat dog world out there anyway, and everybody's just out there for themselves. And that's exactly the kind of mentality that caused all these problems around the world. And for that reason, it is important that we have this realization of what God's love is, and what it does for us. Now, as I place this sharing into a close, let me read to you a scripture written in Romans chapter 8, verse 5 to 15. Those who live according to the flesh have their minds set on what the flesh desires. But those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. The mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those who are in the realm of the flesh cannot please God. And if you're going to think about it, when people are hurt and they think for themselves and become selfish, because after all, everyone is just after themselves, that is where the problem is. That is when your mind is set on the things of the flesh. Take advantage of people, lie, cheat, and steal, because that is how you can win. And if you're going to turn to the Bible, that's exactly what Jesus tells about the devil. The enemy is there to steal, kill, and destroy. In John chapter 10, if I'm not mistaken. And that's the reason why it is important that we renew our minds. In the same book of Romans, if I'm not mistaken, it says in there to renew your mind. Do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world, but be renewed but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you can attest what God's will is, His good, perfect, and pleasing will. And if people will just have a realization of that scripture, then people would transcend beyond the ideology of communism and the flaws of what people see in democracy. Because if everything stems from the Spirit of God, which we can understand by reading His Word, and then we will understand what love is. And that's the reason why I said earlier, that is what will bridge the gap between the cracks and will be the catalyst to heal this broken world. I hope that message encourages you and inspires you. And I'm sorry I'm not going to read the rest of what is written in here. I guess that's just for another sharing. But I hope that this message has given you something to think about, and that you're blessed because somehow there's something for you to think and reconsider, and hopefully for you to see the light and decide to walk in it. God bless.